Sodom and Gomorrah was demolished after that, and his wife turned into a block of salt when she looked back. You believe that happened?
I take my cues from Jesus, who we've already agreed is
Did
historically
that
accurate.
happen?
I believe that Jesus believed the Old Testament to be historically accurate.
Do you believe that that happened?
I believe it happened because Jesus did.
But
I don't think
Nikki,
we know whether Jesus believed it happened or not.
Yeah.
And I believe that appalling, horrendous, horrific story was talking about obedience to God and various other things. It was not about you know, is it literally true, and you know, should we believe it? And we have absolutely no idea whether.
If he was the most righteous man in the village and he offered his virgin daughters as appeasement, what were the rest like?
Well, appalling.
But
you see, it was written about people by men, and they were usually men, with a certain worldview understanding. I mean, if you
what
go
Richard has
to,
identified is there are an awful lot of people in the world who, like Krish, believe it's all true.
Yes, but I think Chris
Yes,
would also say that the most important thing about it, and don't let me put words in your mouth, is that it points to a bigger truth. Yeah. And you say, well, why should the Bible get privileged status? Is because because the other myths that you were referring to earlier have contained truths that we as human beings all resonate to, but perhaps the Bible, taken, opens a window onto truth that has endured, that we see our own human natures spelled out in the pages of the Bible. We can relate to what's going on, and we find a truth that endures.
Adrian Thatcher.
Well, it isn't even true that Jesus thought that that story was true. I mean, when Jesus refers to Sodom and Gomorrah, he's talking about the hospitality laws, which are being grossly infringed by the behaviour of Lot. So to assume that the story is about homosexuality would just be really quite a false thing.
And he didn't even comment on the fact that the poor daughter was put out instead, you know. I mean, he didn't comment on that, unfortunately.
So what lesson are we supposed to get from that story? What moral lesson?
Well, there's somebody
We're going to
missing
come
in
on
the
to the
story.
moral lessons in a minute.
There's somebody missing.
But touch on it now, Richard. What's your
we were
question?
just told that what you get from the Bible is moral lessons, and presumably you say this didn't literally happen, but it's telling us something. What is it telling us?
Well, the moral lesson
let's
is...
listen to the voice that's missing
is,
in this story, which is Abraham. Yeah. Abraham turned to God and argued with God. Exactly. So the message that I get from this story is argue about it, debate about it, don't accept it as true completely.
Well, why in that case? Why didn't? If you want to convey a message, which is in this case argue about it, why not just say argue about it? Why wrap it up?
Do you want to remember that message?
Bishop Michael, is this not, if I may ask
you a question... You don't even know what the message is, that's how obscure it is.
Bishop Michael, allow me to ask the question, please. Yes. Is this not just classically cherry-picking and taking the bits that you're comfortable with?
You are doing the cherry-picking because you chose the story.
Yes.
There are hundreds of more edifying stories in the Bible, but you didn't choose them.
Why don't you ditch that one?
You're the one that was to cherry pick.
Let me just say, you must not confuse, as Professor Dawkins does in his books, between the descriptive aspects of the Bible and the prescriptive ones. Just because the Bible describes some horrendous incident, it doesn't mean that the Bible approves of it. And the point about Abraham, with all due respect to the rabbi, is not that he argued with God, but that he was asking for mercy for the inhabitants of these cities.
That's true.
That is the significant thing. And furthermore, what Jesus saw as significant about Sodom and Gomorrah was that it was its sin, its wickedness, that led to its destruction. That's the lesson to be learned from.
Yes.
Professor Stephen Lowe. What lesson... sorry, Professor, what am I talking about? Professor Richard... Bishop Dawkins. No, that's most certainly not correct. Sorry, Bishop. Bishop Stephen, what lesson do you get from it?
From that particular story?
Yeah. Sorry to cherry-pick, but I thought it was an interesting one to talk about, because it's pretty vile. Carry on.
Because there are a whole number, in a sense, as Richard's pointed out, of myths and stories, particularly in the Old Testament. What I found fascinating is we found it quite difficult so far to talk about the New Testament, which for Christians is where we get our inspiration and understanding of the nature and life of Jesus. And it's fascinating that you have aimed so far the discussion at the Old Testament.
It's chronological, Stephen.
Well, yeah, I'm anxious that we should get on
Right, well,
what is at heart the basis of the Christian faith.
The facts and the extraordinary things that Jesus said.
Well, I mean, let us start with the extraordinary things that Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount, which certainly are part of the oral tradition, which was handed down from man and woman to man and woman as it went through before it was written down. There's, I think, some evidence that those actually were the words of Jesus. And at the very heart of the Christian faith, where we find inspiration and teaching which has inspired people down 2,000 years and changes people's lives, because at the heart of that is a moral code which has actually affected the whole structure of our societies and Western civilization, and had its knock-on into other civilizations as well.
We're going to get on to the morality of it in a minute. Evidence for this, Francesca?
Evidence? What evidence? The only things we know that Jesus said are the things that he is supposed to have said in the New Testament text. I have to say, the Sermon on the Mount, it's a beautiful piece of theology. It's a lovely piece of what some people call social justice. But actually, you know, any Jewish rabbi of the period could have said the same thing. This is a Jewish message. It's not a particularly innovative Christian message. And there's also parallel.
The whole community of theologians and academics who've looked at the historical Jesus, and there are many of them, as you know, from very radical traditions in many cases, have identified certain sayings of Jesus as more likely than not of being original sayings of Jesus.
Not,
OK,
not
I can't prove
anything
about Christianity. I just can't do it. But I do say there's a probability that those words, the words of Jesus, and the fact that they have gone through the ages and survived in that way and have got that element of ring of truth, has inspired people over 2,000 years.
So, Stephen, did he raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he turn the water into wine? Another, if Jesus come now and had a DNA test, half his DNA would come from his mother. What would the reading for the other half be?
You see, I don't find that a very important question for me. The virgin birth is not something I find at the heart of my faith. I find the Sermon on the Mount at the heart of my faith. I find Jesus teaching about justice and poverty and the way in which he inspired people and led people, the way in which he died and rose again. Those are the heart of my faith, not whether he was born of a virgin.
Do you believe he was born of a virgin?
Adrian?
Yeah, I think what you're doing, Nicky, is you're privileging the literal sense. Now, if we ask the question, what is it to read the Bible? Prior to the Reformation, Christians would have gone about it differently. They would have looked for a literal sense. They would have looked for a moral sense. Yeah. They would have looked for some allegorical sense, as if this might have told them something about the transcendent. And lastly, they would have looked for the anagogical sense, which is what we may hope for. Yes. What is there about the future? Yes. Now, at the time of the Reformation, it is the literal sense that gets privileged. That's why there's 45% of people in America who think that Adam and Eve were real people. And that is a gross distortion that has happened in Christianity. And we need to get back to the question, what is it to read the Bible well? And it's certainly not reading the Bible well to assume that everything in it has a kind of glass, literal face to it.
Yes. Let me we're going to go into the moral message from the Bible in just a second. But let's just take some comments from... Can I take you first? Yes. You look like you're vaguely qualified.
Sort of. I just wanted to pick up on the point that Professor Dawkins asked about why didn't Jesus just say, there it is, you know, question.
Oh, God, because he was talking about the Old Testament, I think. The whole point of the way that a lot of the Bible is written, both Old and New Testament, is that it is written in parables, it's written in stories, because that precisely does raise the fact that we are questioning people. And as anybody who's ever preached will know, if you just stand and give a literal message, you end up with law, you end up with stuff that people don't listen to. Whereas if you actually tell stories and put it into poetry, people's imagination is captured, people's emotions are captured, and that's why the Bible is so important and has such a privileged position. I'll take you, then I'll go to the other side. Go on. Morning.
Yes, just going about the Bible, you know, if it's divinely inspired, there's going to be gaps, and Richard Dawkins, you keep mentioning, like, morals, but the Bible's way bigger than just morals, and if half America believes that Adam and Eve was literal, so what? You know, it's just a divinely inspired story.
You believe it is divinely inspired? Let me take this gentleman over here. Hello.
I just like to identify the underlying argument, which I think the panel has touched upon, is that actually there's two sides of